Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajam of all ages, now that we are firmly a good week and a half into Season 4, and people have gotten to experience a pretty large chunk of what's going on, the vast majority of players are just reaching further relative progression than they ever have in the past, with even particularly casual players being able to hit level 100 relatively easily by this point in the season with the way that things are. That said, one new endgame mechanic that was added with the changes to the game is the Artificer's Pit, and this is sort of the ultra endgame mechanic that we have now. The lowest that you can interact with this is at level 100 enemies, and this scales up to being harder than anything else in the game currently as you push up through the tiers of this. As well, it is tied to a major upgrade mechanic for items that was added to in Masterworking. So essentially, now that we've had a fairly reasonable amount of time with it being in the game, and a lot of playtime, both myself and just from the community in general obviously, I thought it would be a good time to just have a discussion about the pit. The good, the bad, what works, what doesn't, and most importantly, how it can be changed and improved, because my overarching opinion is that the pit is honestly a great endgame activity with a number of pretty major but fixable faults, and if those fixes can be implemented, even the top end part of the pit would be much more enjoyable. So let's start off with just the general system and my thoughts on that. One thing that I've been extremely vocal about is that I absolutely adore the changes to how items and upgrades work in Season 4, and Masterworking is no small part of that. There are definitely some irritations that I have with the system, but those almost just completely across the board go back to how bad the gold economy is this season, where the idea of 5 million gold to reset Masterworking progress on an item is actually a sizable investment, especially because there's just no guarantee that you will get what you want the second time either, or the third time, or the fourth time, and so on. So that said, with my enjoyment of the system, I have spent a fair amount of time in the pit because that's where the materials come from to do this. I do enjoy these two things being tied together. I think they both make sense being tied together as well, one being the furthest pushable endgame activity, and the other the final stage of upgrading items, with the potential to boost an affix by up to around 120%, which is pretty silly on the right target. In the pit itself then, you get a timer and a progress bar, and you fill the bar by killing trash enemies. Once the bar is full, you fight a boss, and this is where the tough part comes, really. By and large, the vast majority of people reach their limit of pit pushing capability in the boss fights, not the endless monsters leading up to it, and the reasons for this are twofold. Firstly, the boss echo mechanics. When fighting a pit boss, they will also have an echo of another boss shows up, who will do one of the abilities from their moveset. In some cases, these are other dungeon bosses. You can have Elias from the Capstone dungeon even, and you often see Lilith in these too. Each boss that you face at the end of the pit will always have the same echoes with them, with one of these echoes being involved in the fight at the start, and expanding up to having a full 3 echoes based on their health percentage. Because these echo attacks aren't coming from a physical enemy, they are coming as their own effects, they do way more damage to most people than you might expect, and the reason for that is they don't activate things like damage reduction from close enemies, or from bleeding enemies, or from vulnerable enemies, or just anything like that, because their damage doesn't come from the boss. It is sort of its own unique effect. It comes from the ghost echo. That has led to a lot of high pit pushing being about focusing more general damage reductions to try and reduce the damage of these as well. But even so, no matter how you build, the boss fight is always just way harder than the rest of the entire activity. And no matter how high you push, the thing that stops you will be one-shots more than anything. Not a lack of healing over time or anything like that. And that leads us to my main contentions with the pit. The main 2 negatives that I really have. Dying to one-shots is not fun. If we build up 1,000,000 defensive stats, which is basically what you have to do this type of activity, it shouldn't go from, oh, this damage tickles, to, oh, I'm dead, from one tier to the next, from one enemy to the next even. It should be a more gradual decline in, oh, this is fine, to, oh god, this sucks. Being one shot just isn't fun. Being slowly drained of all your resources in a heroic stand as you guzzle down all of your potions one by one, knowing no matter what you do, it will just be a matter of time. You just sort of have to try and kill the boss within that as best as you can. That is fun. Don't kill me with one-shots, kill me by overwhelming me with just masses of enemies swarming me. Kill me by attrition, because it at least gives me a chance to fight back and feel like I have some level of control. This has sort of always been the issue with any overly difficult, challenging endgame mechanic they've put in Diablo 4, and with the defensive stats now being made much more predictable for the developers with the recent item changes, I can only hope that they will get this one worked out sooner rather than later. The second major negative that I have here is just the imbalance of the scaling as far as where the difficulty is. The bosses heavily outscale the challenge of the full progress bar worth of monsters that you have to bash through to get to the bosses, which just makes the first portion of the pit activity feel sort of pointless in comparison, especially on the highest tiers. If the boss has all of the challenge of the activity, then the only part that you even have to think about and activate your brain for is the boss. It just invalidates half of the activity entirely. So hopefully with time and patches, they will be able to shift this a bit so that the difficulty is just more even between both sections, and so they both matter at least a little bit more equally. But again, these are things that can be changed with player feedback, and so I don't think that we're actually too far off of this being an enjoyable endgame chase activity. After all, the best parts of it shine through regardless of that. Endless monster density, never stopping from one fight to the next, varied enemy types, locations, bosses, and just the snappiness of it when you are farming more comfortable tiers for you, in and out in about 2 minutes per run, or even less with enough movement speed. It just feels so much more satisfying at the lower tiers in my opinion right now, and it does make for a great sort of brain off endless farm at those tiers too. But this brings us to another point of contention that I have here, which is that there just isn't really any meaningful reward for pushing your pit tier higher than about 80 on the vast majority of builds or classes, other than just things like bragging rights of saying that you can. And there's also an achievement if you do a tier 100. You get more of the masterworking materials, sure, for doing higher tiers, but you quickly just hit a point in any build where the time it takes to complete the next tier up is no longer worth the extra materials that you gain from doing so. And so going past that just isn't actually worth it anymore if you're looking for the reward. To fix this and actually incentivize pushing, the two main ideas that I have are, well, just increase the scaling on the amount of pit materials that you gain per tier, pushed past around 90, I would say, and outside of that, make it worth it for the gear that drops too. We do get a handful of items at the end of each pit run, but they tend to be pretty average at best. But Josh mentioned this to me, and I think it would make a lot of sense if the rewards were to scale with the pit tier as well. And what better way to do that than the ultimate endgame mechanic? And what better way to do that for the ultimate endgame mechanic than by giving you more rolls at some of the greater sources of RNG, greater affixes. Quite simply, they could just have a scaling slider of the higher tier pit that you're in, the higher tier you just completed, the higher chance that you have of greater affixes being present on the gear that drops. They can decide how exact the numbers need to be for that system, but I think just as a base is probably a perfect reward for pushing. It can incentivize more masterworking to be done, because if you have a good drop, you have to reset an item from the beginning, and further pushing to be had once you have that item in play too, making yourself stronger, which makes it a proper loop really. Then the final sort of issue I have are the things that are just not dropping at the proper rates this season. The first being stygian stones, a material needed to summon the torment boss versions. These just have an abysmally low drop rate right now. They're supposed to drop from the pit and they rarely ever do, so just bump it up, simple as that. No other comments really needed for that one. And then gold, as I mentioned earlier. Resetting Masterworks is extremely expensive, and Masterworking itself gets super expensive in further ranks as well, even for just upgrading. My thoughts on how to fix this are somewhat twofold. Have the Masterworking reset cost scale with how many upgrades have been done to the item. Why should resetting a 4 out of 12 item cost 5 million gold when getting an item to 4 out of 12 in the first place only costs 750,000? Secondly, and more importantly to the health of the game as a whole, just have the pit itself reward gold at the end. And yes, I know that it does technically, but it rewards just basically non-existent amounts compared to the current economy. Change the values that you get, have it scale properly with the actual tier of pit that you complete, and that way the pit and masterworking itself will fully fuel themselves as a proper loop. Stopping doing pit runs on repeat to go do farm activities that I'm overpowered in just because I need gold is not fun. So why make players do that? Just make the pit reward a proper amount of gold and have it scale so at higher tiers there's just no better source of gold per time in the game, so that it actually matches the scaling cost of masterworking as the most expensive gold drain in the game. And that's it basically. I do want to reiterate, because I spent a lot of time talking about what I don't like and what I would change and how, that I do genuinely really enjoy the pit as an activity. I think the base that it's built upon is incredibly strong, and I think it is the foundation of an extremely enjoyable endgame activity for months, if not years to come, if they fix it up, because I think there are also some pretty important fundamental changes that are needed to get it there. And of course, I wouldn't be talking so passionately and as much detail as I have if it wasn't just on my mind constantly, and that wouldn't happen if I wasn't enjoying the activity to begin with. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and of course let me know your own thoughts down in the comments below, and any ways that you might fix any of these issues or any others that you have noticed yourself. Like if you liked the video, subscribe, hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.